The day Caleb Marsh told the new schoolteacher she wasn't welcome on his land, his daughter was already holding her hand. I saw the whole thing from the corral fence, and I've had 30 years to think on it since, so you'll forgive an old man if he tells it slow in the places that matter. My name is Amos Teller. I forked hay and mended fence and broke horses on the Marsh place from the time Caleb's father ran it till the day my knees gave out. And there is not much that happened on that stretch of the Kettle River I didn't see with my own 2 eyes. This I saw. And I'll tell you true. I have buried friends and I have buried a wife of my own, and I have never in my life watched a man come back from the dead the way I watched Caleb Marsh come back. It started with a little girl's hand and a schoolteacher who wouldn't flinch. But I'm ahead of myself. Let me start where it started, which is with a town that had already made up its mind. Camas Bend in those years was a hard little place strung along a bend in the Kettle, cradled in the Coldwater Range, and it was the kind of town that decided what a person was before that person had finished stepping down off the stage. By the time Della Quaid arrived on the autumn coach with one trunk and a straight back, the town had decided 3 things about her. They decided she was too quiet. They decided a widow that young had no business teaching their children when she ought to be hunting a husband. And they decided she wouldn't last a winter. I happened to be in town that day for nails and salt, and I watched the school board near send her packing on the depot platform before her boots had warmed the boards. There was Hollis Pratt who ran the mercantile and fancied himself the town's conscience, and the widow Greaves who taught the school before her eyes went, and 2 ranchers' wives who'd come mostly to look. They stood her in front of them like she was a horse at auction, and Pratt said the post might be better filled by a married man, and one of the wives said she looked like a strong wind would carry her off. Della Quaid let them finish. She had a way of letting people finish that I came to know well. Then she said, in a voice quiet enough you had to lean in, that she'd taught 4 years in a worse country than this, that she'd come a long way on her own coin, and that she would teach their children to read and cipher and write a fair hand whether the town liked the look of her or not, and that she expected to be paid on the 1st of the month, the same as a married man would be. Pratt blinked. The wives looked at each other. And the thing got settled, not because they warmed to her, but because nobody had a good answer to a woman who simply would not be moved. That was the first time I understood there was iron in her. It would not be the last. Now you can't understand what came after without understanding Caleb Marsh, so let me set him down in front of you the way he was. He'd been the gladdest man in that valley once. I'd known him since he was a boy chasing me around the barn, and there was a stretch of years, after he married Eliza and brought her home to the Kettle, when the Marsh place rang with it. Eliza was a laughing, dark-haired girl from the Greenwater country, and she filled that ranch house up like sun fills a window. When little Tess was born, I have never seen a man so proud he could hardly speak. He'd carry that baby out to the corral and hold her up so she could see the horses and tell her, solemn as a preacher, the name of everyone. Then Eliza took the lung fever in the worst winter I can recall, and in 9 days she was gone, and Caleb Marsh was a widower at 31 with a daughter not yet 2 years old. I won't dress it up. Something in him died with her and did not come back. He didn't fall to drink the way some do. He fell to silence, which is harder to watch. He worked. Lord, how he worked fences that didn't need mending, ditches dug twice, the herd ridden in weather no sane man rode. He raised Tess the way a man raises a child he's afraid to love too much, which is to say he kept her fed and clothed and warm and at arm's length, because every time he looked full at that little girl he saw the woman who wasn't there. He believed, and he'd near enough said it to me once late, by a dying fire, that he was cursed in it. That love was a thing the ground took from him. That everything he set his heart on he lost. The valley believed it too. They'd shake their heads and say, poor Caleb Marsh, his heart's buried out there on the rise with Eliza and no woman'll ever dig it up. They said it like a fact. They said it like a doom. And the worst of it, the part that cut me, was that he'd come to believe loving Tess full strength would only mark her for the same. So he loved her crooked, from the side, with his hands and never his words. That was the man. And this was the autumn the schoolteacher came. Tess was 6 that year, and she'd been going to the widow Greaves's little school and learning next to nothing, because the widow could no longer see the slate. So when Della Quaid opened the Camas Bend School in the old chapel building, Tess Marsh was among the children who filed in. And it took Della Quaid about a week to notice that the Marsh girl, bright as a new dime, quick as a barn cat, was a child starving for something that wasn't food. I knew none of this at the time. I learned it the way you learn weather, by what it did. What it did was this. Tess started coming home from school different. Lighter. She'd repeat things at supper, Miss Quaid says. Miss Quaid showed us, and Caleb would grunt and keep his eyes on his plate. She started bringing home papers with stars marked on them and leaving them where her father would have to move them, which is a thing a child does when she is trying to be seen by someone who won't look. Caleb moved them without a word. Then came the afternoon I told you about at the start. It was the first hard cold of the season, a sky the color of a gun barrel, and Della Quaid drove a hired buggy out the Kettle Road to the Marsh place, because Tess had stayed 3 days from school and she meant to know why. The truth, which I knew and Caleb wouldn't say, was that the child had no proper winter coat that fit, and Caleb hadn't yet got to town to see to it, and he'd rather keep her home than send her cold, and he'd rather die than have the town know he'd let a thing like that slip. Pride and grief make a poor pair to raise a child by. Della pulled up in the yard, and Tess came flying off the porch like she'd been shot from a bow, and took hold of that schoolteacher's hand with both of her own and would not let go. And Caleb came out of the barn wiping his hands and stopped dead when he saw whose buggy it was. I was at the corral. I had a good seat. He told her flat, hard. The voice he used to keep the world at the length of his arm, that he was obliged for her trouble but his daughter's schooling was his own affair and she could turn that buggy around. He told her, in not so many words, that she wasn't welcome on marsh land. And the whole time he was saying it, his daughter was standing there holding the woman's hand and looking up at her like she'd hung the moon. Della Quaid looked at the child's hand in hers. Then she looked at Caleb Marsh and she did the thing I'd seen her do on the depot platform. She let him finish. And when he was done she said, quiet, "Your girl is the brightest child in my school, Mr. Marsh. She's been out 3 days. I came to see if she was sick. She isn't sick." A pause. "She's cold." And then she did a thing that took the wind clean out of him. She reached into the buggy and brought out a child's wool coat, good and warm, plainly her own doing. She'd cut it down from something, you could see the new stitching, and she crouched right down in the cold yard and put it on Tess and did up the buttons, and she did not ask his leave to do it. She just did it, the way a person does a thing that needs doing. Caleb Marsh stood there with his mouth half open and nothing in it. "Expect her Monday," Della said, standing. She put her hand once light on Tess's head. Then she climbed back in the buggy and drove off down the Kettle Road into that gun barrel cold, and she never once looked back to see what he'd do, because I came to understand looking back to see what he'd do would have been asking, and she had decided a good while ago to stop asking the world's permission for anything. Tess wore that coat to supper, wore it in the house, wouldn't take it off. And Caleb Marsh ate his meal and said not one word, but I caught him once looking at his daughter in that coat with an expression I hadn't seen on him in 5 years, and I'll tell you what it was because it took me a day to name it. It was shame. The good kind. The kind that's the first crack in a wall. She came Monday and every school day after, that child, in her good warm coat, and Della Quaid taught her, and somewhere in there a thing began that the whole valley would have told you was impossible, and most of them tried to. Because here is what you have to understand about Della Quaid, the thing I only got the whole of much later. She knew about doom. She'd buried a husband herself, back east, a young man, a fever, the same as Eliza near enough. And she'd buried a child too, an infant that never drew breath, and she had come west not to find a husband, whatever the town thought, but to find a place where her grief didn't have her dead husband's mother sitting across the table from it every morning. She wasn't a woman who didn't know what the ground takes. She was a woman who'd had it taken and had decided, somewhere on that long road west, that she would keep on loving things anyway. That to do otherwise was to let the dying win twice. She was, in other words, the one person in that valley who could look Caleb Marsh's particular curse straight in the eye and not be afraid of it, because she'd looked at her own. The winter came down hard that year, the way it does in the cold water. And as it came down, a thing thawed. It was slow. It was Tess mostly at first. Tess was the bridge, the way children are. She talked about Miss Quaid till her father had a picture of the woman in his head whether he wanted one or not. She brought home a book Della had lent her and read it out loud by the fire, stumbling and proud, and Caleb, who I'd swear had not sat still by his own fire in 5 years, sat still and listened to his daughter read. Then there was the day Tess fell sick for real, a bad croup, and it was Della Quaid who came out the Kettle Road through 6 inches of new snow because she'd heard the child was ailing, and it was Della who sat up the night with her, who knew to steam the room and ease the breathing, who held that little girl through the worst of it while Caleb stood in the doorway like a man at the edge of a cliff. I'll tell you the moment it turned. It was near dawn, the fever broke, Tess slept, and Della Quaid came out into the cold kitchen where Caleb sat with his head in his hands. She poured herself coffee like she'd a right to it, and she sat down across from him, and for a while neither of them said anything. Then Caleb Marsh said the most words I think he'd said to a grown soul in 5 years. He said his wife had died in that house, in that very room, of a fever, and that he'd held her the same as Della had held Tess, and it hadn't been enough. And ever since he had known, he said, like a stone, that loving was just the long road to losing, and that the kindest thing he could do for his girl was to keep from loving her so hard it'd mark her too. And Della Quaid, who had every reason in the world to flinch from that, did not flinch. She said quiet, the way she said the hard things, that she'd buried a husband and a baby both, and that she'd believed the same thing on the worst nights, that loving was just the long road to losing. And then she said the thing I have carried in my own chest ever since, the thing that I think saved that man's life, she said. But the losing comes either way, Mr. Marsh. It comes whether you love them soft or love them hard or hold them off at the length of your arm. It comes the same. The only thing you get to choose is whether they were loved while they were here. She nodded toward the room where his daughter slept. That child is going to lose you someday, the way we all lose everyone. The only question you get a say in is whether she'll have been loved out loud while she had you. And right now, the way you're going, the answer's no, and you're calling that protecting her. She set down her cup. It isn't. It's the curse doing your loving for you, and it's robbing her blind. There was a long silence in that kitchen. The fire ticked, and Caleb Marsh, who had not wept where a soul could see him since the day they put Eliza in the ground, put his hand over his eyes and his shoulders shook, and he wept for his wife, and for 5 lost years, and for the daughter he'd been loving from the side because he was too afraid to love her from the front. Della Quaid didn't reach for him, and she didn't say there. She just sat with him and let him, the way she let people finish. She knew the difference between a man who needs his grief soothed and a man who needs it witnessed. He needed it witnessed. When the sun came up, he walked her to her buggy, and at the buggy he stopped and he said, rough, that he didn't know how to do what she'd said, how to love out loud, that he'd forgotten the way of it. And Della Quaid smiled at him, the first real smile I think he'd drawn out of her, and said he could start by saying good morning to his daughter like he was glad to see her, and they'd go from there. He started that morning. I heard him, plain as anything through the kitchen window, "Mornin', Tess." And the child went still with the wonder of it and then lit up like a lamp, and the Marsh house was a half a degree warmer from that day on. The valley, of course, had opinions. By midwinter it was all over Camas Bend that the widow schoolteacher was making free of the Marsh place, and the town that had decided what Della Quaid was on the depot platform now decided she was a schemer after a widower's land. And the town that had decided Caleb Marsh's heart was buried with Eliza now decided he was a fool to dig it up. And Holly's Pratt at the Mercantile took it on himself to say a word, to Caleb's face, in the store, in front of folks, about how some men disgraced a good wife's memory before she was cold. I was there for that too. I'd come in for the mail, Caleb Marsh, who 6 months before would have taken that and swallowed it and gone home to his silence, set down what he was buying. The store went quiet. And he said, not loud, but in a voice that carried, that Eliza Marsh had been the gladdest soul he ever knew, that she'd loved that child more than her own life, and that there was not one thing in this world Eliza would have wanted less than for her daughter to grow up cold in a house run by a grieving man too scared to love her. He said honoring his wife's memory meant raising her girl glad, the way Eliza would have. And he said the next man who called Della Quaid a schemer in his hearing had better be ready to back it, because she'd come out the Kettle Road through 6 inches of snow to sit up a night with a sick child that wasn't her own, asking nothing. And that was a finer thing than anyone in this store had done that whole hard winter, Holly's Pratt included. Then he picked up his goods and walked out, and I followed him, and I'll be honest with you, I was grinning like a fool the whole way to the wagon, because the boy I'd chased around the barn was back, and then some. That was the winter the doom broke. Not all at once, but it broke. Spring came up the kettle the way it does, sudden and green, and one Sunday Caleb Marsh put on his good shirt and drove his daughter into Camas Bend, and the two of them walked up to the little house where the schoolteacher boarded, and Tess had picked a fistful of wild camas flowers along the road and had them crushed in her hand. And Della Quaid came to the door. I had the story of this part from Tess herself, years on, so I'll trust her telling. Caleb stood there with his hat in his hands like a boy, and the words wouldn't come. The man could face down outlaws, but a schoolteacher in a doorway undid him, and it was Tess who saved him. Tess, 6 years old, stepped forward and put her crushed flowers into Della Quaid's hands and said, clear as a bell, Miss Quaid, my papa doesn't know how to ask, so I'm asking. Will you come live with us and be my mama? I already decided. I decided a long time ago. And the whole valley's verdict, buried, doomed, no woman'll ever dig it up, came apart right there in that doorway on the say-so of a 6-year-old girl who hadn't been told it was impossible. Della Quaid knelt down to Tess's height, the way she'd knelt in the cold yard to button that coat, and she looked the child in the eye and said this was a thing she'd be glad of with her whole heart. Then she stood, and she looked at Caleb Marsh, because a child's asking is a sweet thing but a woman chooses for herself, and she'd not be chosen for. And Caleb, out loud, the way she'd taught him, said he'd buried his heart out on that rise 5 years ago and made his peace with it being gone, and that she dug it up without his leave, the same as she did everything, and he'd be obliged to her for the rest of his days if she'd keep it. He said he couldn't promise her the ground wouldn't take from them both someday, because it takes from everyone, but he could promise she'd be loved out loud every day she had him. He'd learned that, he said. A hard teacher had taught him. She said yes, on her own terms in her own time, choosing freely, and the only thing in her face was a woman done being afraid of the thing that scares everybody. They married that spring, plain and small, out under the cottonwoods by the kettle, with the whole valley come round whether they'd had opinions or not, because folks will turn out for gladness even when they've sworn off it. The parson said his words. Tess stood between them in a new dress and held both their hands like she meant to weld the 3 of them together by main force. And when it was done, Caleb Marsh kissed his bride once, gentle, and the valley let out a breath it had been holding for 5 years. I danced at that wedding. My knees were better then. Now I told you I'd had 30 years to think on it, and I have, so let me finish the way an old man finishes, which is from the far end. They had a long life, those two. Not an easy one, the Coldwater country is never easy, and there were lean years and hard winters, and a brother of mine and 2 good horses lost in a flood, and Caleb's own hair gone white before its time. But it was a glad life, and that's a different thing than easy. Della Quaid Marsh taught school another 6 years and then taught her own house full of children, for Tess got brothers and a sister in time, and that ranch house on the kettle rang again the way it had when I was young, the way Eliza had filled it once, and nobody ever pretended Eliza hadn't been. She stayed honored on that rise, and Della saw to the flowers there herself every spring, which tells you the whole size of the woman. Caleb went first, as it happened, an old man in his bed in the spring, with his wife holding his hand and his grown children round him. And I was there because they'd sent for me, and I held his other hand, The fool boy I chased around the barn, 80 years old and white as snow. And near the end he wasn't afraid. I want you to know that. The man who'd believed for 5 years that love was just the long road to losing. He came to the end of that road and he wasn't afraid, because every soul in that room had been loved out loud by him. Every day they'd had him and he knew it, and they knew it, and there was nothing left unsaid to be sorry for. The losing came, the way Della always said it would. But it found a house where the loving had already been done, and out loud, and there was no doom in it anywhere. Just grief, which is love's honest price, and which a man can carry when he knows it was earned. The valley had said his heart was buried with his wife, and it had been. But I was at the corral the day a little girl took a schoolteacher's hand and wouldn't let go, and I'm here to tell you the valley was wrong. It wasn't buried. It was only waiting on someone brave enough to dig, and on a child too young to have been told it couldn't be done. I've outlived nearly all of them now. But I think on that yard, and that coat buttoned in the cold, and a small voice in a doorway saying I already decided. I decided a long time ago. And I think the bravest thing I ever saw in a long life of rough country wasn't any standoff, or any flood, or any winter. It was two people who knew exactly what the ground takes, choosing to love anyway.